Have you ever paused to consider that our civilization may be living through a unique, unprecedented historical experiment? One in which the very mechanisms of knowledge, communication, and governance that should save us are being rendered almost impotent by the systems we ourselves have created? That the greatest danger we face today is not ignorance in the traditional sense, but a deliberate and systemic incapacity to act upon knowledge we already possess? This is not a philosophical abstraction, nor an intellectual exercise. It is the lived experience of those who have dedicated decades, sometimes lifetimes, to observing the arc of human history, the dynamics of societies, and the mechanisms by which knowledge translates or fails to translate into action. For millennia, thinkers and leaders have warned civilizations of their impending crises. Greek philosophers cautioned against the hubris of city-states. Roman senators saw decadence and warned of collapse. Enlightenment thinkers outlined the dangers of concentrated power and social stagnation. Economists, sociologists, and scientists have, for centuries, attempted to map the predictable patterns that precede collapse, inequality, war, and ecological disaster. Yet, for all this insight, history has repeatedly shown a single tragic constant. Knowledge alone does not compel action, and the difference today is stark. Unlike any previous era, the full weight of accumulated human wisdom is available to nearly everyone almost instantaneously. Books, data, visualizations, simulations, predictive models, none of these are out of reach. The libraries of the world are now in our pockets. But the paradox is that this accessibility has coincided with the proliferation of systemic resistance, deliberate distortion, and selective blindness. The 21st century has presented a dual revolution: the democratization of knowledge and the democratization of ignorance. Never before have we had the capacity to understand so much and act so little. Algorithms reward outrage over reason, virality over accuracy, immediacy over depth. Social networks designed to connect us have instead become echo chambers that amplify pre-existing biases. News cycles measure attention in seconds, while the consequences of our collective choices unfold over decades, even centuries. Climate thresholds, political tipping points, technological singularities, they do not wait for trending hashtags or viral memes. They advance regardless of human attention, consequence indifferent to human vanity. The climate crisis, for instance, has progressed. According to the projections scientists warned us of decades ago, the data, models, and analysis have been clear and accessible. Yet, policy responses have been delayed, diluted, or outright sabotaged. Economists have predicted the social consequences of inequality and unsustainable growth. Political philosophers have outlined the pathways from polarization to authoritarianism. Technologists have illuminated the ways digital systems can manipulate and control human behavior. And still, the warnings fall upon ears conditioned to listen only to what is comforting, convenient, or entertaining. Consider the psychological weight of this situation for those who see the patterns clearly. Imagine the climatologist who meticulously maps the rise of global temperatures, predicts the cascade of ecological collapse, and watches as their warnings are dismissed as ideology. Imagine the political scientist who traces the historical arc of democratic decay and sees the same patterns unfolding in real time, only to be accused of pessimism. Imagine the technologist who anticipates a future in which AI systems manipulate belief, behavior, and perception on a global scale, while the world marvels at the conveniences these same systems provide. For those whose lives are devoted to understanding these dynamics, the experience is a unique form of suffering. To know the precipice exists, to see society walking toward it, and to recognize that the mechanisms intended to prevent disaster are increasingly ineffectual. And so we arrive at the era in which the patience of the wise is being tested like never before. This is not a metaphorical impatience. It is a real, quantifiable tension between understanding and action, knowledge and implementation, foresight and collective choice. For Mo, of human history, the wise were limited by the scarcity of communication. Their voices could be ignored due to access constraints. Today, access is limitless, and yet resistance has never been greater. The paradox is profound. The easier it is to convey knowledge, the more fiercely systems react to resist it. The clearer the evidence, the louder the pushback. The more irrefutable the analysis, the more creative the distortions. 2026 is not simply a calendar date. It is a symbolic convergence. It marks a moment when the accumulated crises of climate, technology, politics, and economics may intersect with a society increasingly incapable of responding with rational, coordinated, and informed action. Climate systems may reach irreversible tipping points. Technological concentrations of power may become ungovernable. Democratic institutions may fracture under the weight of polarization. Economic inequality may reach levels historically correlated with systemic upheaval, and cultural structures may have evolved to reward disinformation, tribalism, and ideological rigidity over collective understanding. The question before us is not merely whether the world will survive. It is whether our systems of governance, our capacity for collective reasoning, and our moral frameworks can act effectively in time. What is particularly perilous in our era is the active erosion of mechanisms that historically allowed civilizations to correct course. Education, once the cornerstone of critical thought, is increasingly politicized, underfunded, or captured by narratives that discourage questioning. Media, once intended to inform, increasingly rewards spectacle over substance. Democratic processes, once designed to mediate diverse interests and knowledge, now reward tribal allegiance and emotional manipulation. The result is that the very tools for survival, adaptation, and reform are being neutralized at the exact moment they are most needed. This crisis is not abstract. It is existential. When the wisdom of societies is systematically ignored, delayed, or actively resisted, the consequences are predictable. History has shown time and again that systems incapable of integrating knowledge cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. Civilizations collapse not because they lacked insight, but because they failed to act upon it. What distinguishes our era is that we have the knowledge to prevent collapse, and yet we may lack the collective will to do so. And this brings us to the central tension of our time: how to reconcile freedom with survival, democracy with expertise, choice with consequence. The liberal ideal that all voices are equal, while morally appealing, is proving increasingly difficult to reconcile with the practical necessity of acting upon highly specialized knowledge. The digital era has amplified individual agency but diminished collective prudence. Every decision is magnified across billions of interactions, yet the processes for evaluating those decisions remain chaotic and often self-defeating. What kind of society can survive when millions of decisions are informed by emotion, ideology, or convenience rather than reason, evidence, and long-term consequence? The responses of the wise to these challenges will not be uniform. Some will persist in traditional roles, writing, teaching, and attempting to influence policy. Others will embrace more direct forms of intervention, leveraging expertise to guide decisions in real time. Still others may abandon the public sphere entirely, redirecting their energies into private projects, alternative communities, or systems outside the reach of dysfunctional institutions. Each path reflects a recognition of the same fundamental truth: that the old methods of societal guidance may no longer suffice, and that patience, once virtually infinite, has limits. There is also a more troubling possibility: that a portion of the wise may conclude that existing democratic frameworks are incompatible with the urgent demands of survival. Not out of desire for authoritarianism, but out of necessity. When survival depends on immediate, coordinated, evidence-based action, and the mechanisms for such action are systematically blocked. Leaders, scientists, and philosophers may face ethical dilemmas with no historically familiar solutions. They may recognize that the very freedoms they cherish, freedom of opinion, freedom of debate, freedom of choice, are precisely the conditions that endanger the civilization they seek to preserve. The paradox is stark. We have never possessed the knowledge to navigate our challenges so fully, yet we may lack the collective capacity to implement it. We know how to create sustainable energy systems, just as we know how to regulate AI and build resilient institutions. We understand the dynamics of inequality, polarization, and ecological collapse. Yet our social systems reward short-term gain, emotional gratification, and tribal loyalty over prudence, foresight, and wisdom. The solutions exist, the evidence is clear, but the cultural and political machinery required to apply them is strained to the breaking point. 2026, then, is not an apocalyptic date. It is a threshold of perception, a symbolic marker for a civilization at the limits of patience, knowledge, and systemic resilience. It is the year when the mismatch between our capacity to know and our capacity to act may become impossible to ignore. It is a year when the silent frustration of the wise may transform into visible, consequential action, or alternately, into withdrawal, as those most capable of guiding us recognize that the cost of engagement exceeds the potential for meaningful change. This is a moment of profound historical significance. The choices made or deferred in the coming years may determine not only the survival of nations, but the viability of civilization itself. Will we act collectively, guided by knowledge, foresight, and moral courage? Or will we allow the inertia of convenience, the seduction of ideology, and the dysfunction of our institutions to dictate the outcome? The answer is uncertain, but the stakes are clear. We are witnessing the moment when the patient guardians of human wisdom may reach the limits of their tolerance, and when history will judge whether society has been willing to meet them halfway. The central question for every individual, every institution, and every society is this: when knowledge confronts action, when wisdom confronts resistance, when survival confronts choice, where will we stand? Will we continue to ignore the patterns that are staring us in the face, or will we act with the foresight, courage, and coherence that civilization has demanded of its most capable stewards for thousands of years? History offers no second chances, and the clock is now unmistakably ticking. Have you ever paused long enough to realize that we may be living through a historical anomaly, a moment unlike any other, in which the accumulated knowledge of humanity is more abundant, more precise, and more accessible than ever before, and yet, paradoxically, more ineffectual in shaping collective decisions? For the first time in recorded history, the tools to anticipate, understand, and mitigate the crises facing civilization are at the fingertips of billions. Yet, at the same time, the mechanisms for applying this knowledge in ways that protect the continuity of societies, the stability of institutions, and the survival of ecosystems are under siege. This paradox is at the heart of the existential tension of our era, and it is an observation that has driven many of the wisest among us to a form of intellectual frustration historically unprecedented. Throughout human history, civilizations have faced existential crises. The Greek city-states confronted internal decadence and external threats, and some survived by reforming institutions while others collapsed under the weight of hubris and mismanagement. The Roman Republic fell not merely because of invasion or military failure, but because the mechanisms for balancing power enforcing law, and mediating competing interests eroded over generations. In every historical example, there were those who saw the danger clearly: philosophers, historians, generals, economists, and prophets who understood the patterns that led to collapse. Some were ignored, some were silenced, others were dismissed as pessimists, as cynics, as unpatriotic. The tragedies that followed were, in many ways, preventable, but only if societies had been willing to heed wisdom and act upon it. What distinguishes the present moment is that ignorance, in the traditional sense, is no longer a plausible explanation for inaction. The warnings are public, rigorous, and verifiable. Climate scientists have mapped the rising temperatures, predicted the cascading effects on ecosystems, and outlined thresholds beyond which damage becomes irreversible. Political scientists and sociologists have detailed the pathways by which polarization erodes democratic norms and how the collapse of trust in institutions precedes authoritarian consolidation. Economists have warned repeatedly that extreme inequality destabilizes societies, fosters resentment, and catalyzes unrest. Technologists have demonstrated both the liberating potential of digital networks and the dangerous concentration of power in platforms that manipulate perception at scale. All of this knowledge is available, all of it is accessible. And yet, despite its availability, we have failed systematically to integrate it into societal choices. This failure is not accidental. It is facilitated by a combination of structural incentives, technological architecture, and cultural shifts that actively resist the translation of knowledge into action. Social media algorithms, for example, reward virality and emotional engagement over accuracy. Political systems, particularly in democracies, reward short-term popularity and rhetorical simplicity over long-term planning and evidence-based policy. Cultural narratives increasingly prioritize subjective experience and identity over objective knowledge and collective responsibility. In this environment, the most careful analyses, the most meticulously constructed forecasts, the most rigorously validated models are treated as just another opinion, often one that can be attacked, ridiculed, or ignored with impunity. For those who dedicate their lives to understanding these dynamics, the effect is emotionally profound. It is not merely a professional frustration, it is a form of ethical anguish. Imagine an epidemiologist who spends decades modeling the spread of disease, anticipating pandemics, and designing preventive strategies, only to have the majority of the population ignore the warnings until catastrophe strikes, and then be blamed for not acting sooner. Imagine a climatologist observing the rise of global temperatures, predicting severe ecological consequences, and watching policies consistently fail to reflect the urgency indicated by the data. Imagine a historian tracing the patterns of social collapse, seeing echoes of the past in contemporary events, and finding that the lessons of centuries are dismissed in favor of ideological narratives or entertainment spectacles. This is not arrogance on the part of the knowledgeable. It is a profound, historically informed despair over humanity's apparent inability to act in accordance with what it already knows. The era of 2026 is emerging as a symbolic threshold. It is not a prophecy in the sense of predicting an apocalyptic event on a specific calendar date. Rather, it represents a convergence of multiple crises that have been developing over decades, each of which individually is capable of destabilizing societies, and together may overwhelm our capacity for measured, democratic, and rational response. The climate crisis approaches thresholds of irreversibility that have been precisely modeled, yet remain politically unaddressed. Political systems, particularly in large democracies, are exhibiting levels of polarization that historically precede institutional breakdown. Technological systems are concentrating unprecedented power in ways that may soon exceed the capacity of existing governance structures to control. Economic inequality, at the highest levels recorded in modern history, threatens to produce social convulsions that cannot be mitigated through conventional policy. And cultural systems reward emotional manipulation, ideological entrenchment, and selective ignorance, undermining collective reasoning at every level. What makes this historical moment unique is the interplay between knowledge and inaction. In prior civilizations, the obstacle to wise action was often lack of information. Today, the obstacle is not scarcity of knowledge but the systemic failure to act on it. This is a subtle but profound distinction. It is easier for a society to ignore wisdom when it is rare. It is far more dangerous when wisdom is abundant, validated, and yet systematically marginalized. This is the paradox of our era. The very tools designed to liberate human understanding, data, networks, algorithms, global communication, have also amplified the human tendency to ignore, distort, and weaponize knowledge. The human mind struggles with complexity, and social systems compound this challenge. Problems in the modern era are rarely isolated. Climate change, for example, interacts with economic inequality, political instability, and technological disruption. Pandemics intersect with global supply chains, migration patterns, and political polarization. Artificial intelligence amplifies both human capacity and human bias. Each domain affects the others, creating feedback loops that are nonlinear, unpredictable, and potentially catastrophic. Those who study these systems understand the necessity of coordinated, informed, and anticipatory action. The rest of society, distracted by the immediacy of daily life, the spectacle of media, and the comforts of denial, often behaves as if complexity does not exist. This dissonance between what we know and what we has tangible consequences. Consider the social and political dynamics in which trust in expertise is undermined, while platforms for mass persuasion are optimized to reward emotional resonance over rational coherence. Policies are enacted that are demonstrably harmful in the long term because they are popular in the short term. Cultural incentives reward simplification and certainty over nuance and probabilistic reasoning. Education, the traditional vessel for cultivating critical thinking, has been politicized, undermined, and starved of resources, creating generations of citizens equipped more to consume than to evaluate, more to follow instinct than to reason. In such a system, the mechanisms for survival, collective reasoning, democratic accountability, and institutional resilience are eroded precisely when they are most needed. The cumulative effect of these trends is a unique test of patience for the wise. Historically, the most insightful members of a society, scientists, philosophers, historians, and technologists, could endure periods of marginalization because there were still structural avenues for gradual reform and slow accumulation of influence. Today, however, these avenues are being systematically narrowed. The window for action, once measured in decades, may now be measured in years. The costs of delay are no longer theoretical, they are imminent. The consequences of failure will be immediate, visible, and historically consequential. It is at this juncture that we must confront uncomfortable questions. What happens when the structures of democratic deliberation, cultural persuasion, and institutional enforcement fail to respond to existential challenges? What choices will the wise make when their repeated warnings are ignored and their expertise is treated as optional? Historically, there are three possible pathways. Some will persist in their traditional roles, trusting that truth will eventually find application. Others will intervene more directly, attempting to influence systems through political, social, or technological levers. Still others may withdraw, redirecting their energies into spaces where their influence is more effective, even if this means disengagement from the broader civilization. Each choice reflects the same underlying tension, the limits of patience, the constraints of time, and the necessity of action in the face of escalating crises. The consequences of inaction are profound. If the patient stewards of human knowledge withdraw from the public sphere, the capacity of society to respond to complex, interrelated challenges diminishes dramatically. Expertise will no longer serve as a corrective force, but may instead retreat into isolated communities, private institutions, or alternative frameworks outside the reach of mainstream decision-making. The very notion of collective survival, which depends on the integration of knowledge into collective choice, will be placed in jeopardy. The paradox of abundance will have transformed into a crisis of efficacy. The more we know, the less capable we may be of acting. In this context, the year 2026 is emblematic. It is the moment when multiple converging crises, the ecological, political, technological,